This podcast is sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. By Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Experience the difference an independent pharmacy can make for you and your loved ones. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy offers personalized care, short wait time, very competitive pricing, easy transfer of your prescription, and much more. And by Molly Maid. During these times of COVID-19, it has never been more important to keep your family safe. With the Healthy Home Cleaning System, Molly Maid London is here to help. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Today, we welcome Professor and author Joshua McNall. We discuss his recently released book, Perhaps, Reclaiming the Space Between Doubt and Dogmatism. This incredible book encourages readers to reclaim the little word perhaps as a sacred space between the warring extremes of unchecked doubt and zealous dogmatism. To say perhaps on a certain contested topics means exercising a hopeful imagination, asking hard questions, returning once again to Scripture, and reclaiming the place of holy speculation as we cling to a faith that stands distinct from both pervasive skepticism and abrasive certainty. In this day especially, it's time Christians learn to say perhaps.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be listening. We welcome you back to another edition of the Vicar's Crossing podcast. The Vicar's Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. And we're happy to intersect with you today, wherever you may be. I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church here in London, Ontario.
And I am Kevin George from St. Aidan's Anglican Church, also in London, Ontario.
And my name is Ian. I'm a singer-songwriter, producer, content creator, and the person that gets this podcast out to you.
Amen.
All right. All right, guys. Good to see everybody today, and it'll be good to see our guest, who we'll be inviting in just a few moments. We're really happy that we were able to get a hold of Joshua McNall, and he's coming in, a professor and author, and his book is called Perhaps, Reclaiming the Space Between Doubt and Dogmatism. And Joshua will be joining us here in just a few moments.
Yeah, amazing guy. And this book, Perhaps, is really, well, perhaps it's a very good book.
Perhaps.
I mean, we don't want to jump to any conclusions, but
well, it's kind of on the cover, so
it better be, right? I mean, So anyway, listen, we want to do a land acknowledgement, right? So today we want to acknowledge that the podcast that we record is on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenawee, and Attawandaron peoples on lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. These are and continue to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we respect as vital contributors to our society and with whom we work towards reconciliation.
Very good. And we do want to point out too, September 30th, National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. We hope our listeners do take some time and reflect on that day and make it an important part of your week this week. Okay.
Amen.
We have our sponsors to thank too today, and we've got some wonderful sponsors who we're so appreciative of. To A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. And many, many thanks to Dave Mullen and the staff at A. Miller George Funeral Home today.
Yes, and to Carol Basada at Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved. Get all your pharmaceutical needs from there. Say the words Revy Kevy, get 10% off on everything over the counter.
And last but certainly not least, a special thank you to Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And Trisha Lister was the wonderful human being that hooked us up with that one. So many thanks to them over there.
All right, great. Thanks to all of our sponsors today. And thanks to all of our guests. We really do appreciate that they take the time out of their busy schedules. Most of these folks have more things to do than we'll ever have in our life. They're just busy people. So when they carve out that hour or so just to sit down with us, we really appreciate that. And we've had some wonderful guests so far, and we've got more coming up. So Kevin, it's time for a favorite segment here on the Vicar's Crossing. Who in the world did we book this week?
Who in the world did it? Well, I'm glad you asked. Drum roll, please.
Please. Please, thank you.
Okay, today I am happy to say, like just before I came on here, I got confirmation that we are going to bring back one of the favorites of our podcast, John Pavlovitz, who has a new book dropping today. And he's going to be with us in October to talk about that. So we welcome back John Pavlovitz, who I will say is a provocateur, a prophet, a public theologian, a fantastic guy. Look forward to seeing John Pavlovitz and listening to John Pavlovitz back on this podcast. How often can you say Pavlovitz, and can you say it real fast?
and he will be able to add two-timer to the Vickers Crossing podcast onto his long resume too. So,
amen.
So that's good. Great. We'll look forward to that. And today, of course, as I say, we're looking forward to chatting with Dr. Joshua McNall today. And he is stepping on in here. So we'll take a deep breath and bring him in. Perhaps he will be. We hope he will be.
Is that him? Perhaps it's him. Perhaps it's not knocking on the door. Perhaps it's someone else. Perhaps we should check.
And Josh is here. Josh, welcome to the Vickers Crossing. We're so glad that you could spend some time with us. How you doing?
I'm doing well, and I really appreciate you having me on. I've been, of all the titles for ministers in my life, the thing I've been feeling like I need some vicars.
Oh, we all need vicars.
We need the vicar here and there. Definitely.
Do you have Vicks Vapor Rub in Oklahoma?
Yeah, we've used it with our kids, and they have a little runny nose or something.
Yeah,
put a little Vicks on there. So do you get royalties, or you get sort of?
I don't. Every time I hear the word vicar, though, that's what I think about is Vicks Vapor. And I have a sister-in-law. God bless you. Shout out to Jackie, who when she was a kid, they used to have her eat it if she had a cold. I don't think it was meant for that, but this was Newfoundland, so we did things differently out there. But anyway, I think it's topical. But apparently it works if you ingest it too. Sure. Folks listening at home, do not ingest. This is not like President Trump's bleach. Okay, don't do it.
This
don't
is a great
do
way
it.
to start. This is a wonderful way to start.
Send your letters to Ian if anything goes.
Send your letters to Ian.
South. Yeah. Well, Josh, we're thrilled that you're here with us today. If we would just tell a little bit to our listeners about where you are and where you teach and.
Yeah, I teach at a place called Oklahoma Wesleyan University, which is in northeastern Oklahoma. It's connected with a denomination called the Wesleyan Church. So I suppose we'd be kind of like grandkids or great grandkids of the Anglican.
Good
tradition.
Anglican Wesley.
Right.
Yep.
By way of JW there. And I teach theology. I teach kind of church and culture type courses, and I run our honors program on campus, which is really fun to get to work with students from different disciplines. And then my last hat that I wear is I travel for the school and do some speaking to promote the university as a kind of church relations ambassador. So
cool.
I think you've got a great podcast.
Yeah, I host a podcast called Outpost Theology, sort of at the frontier of theology, culture, in the church, and talk to authors, kind of like you guys do.
Yeah.
Great. And of course, you're a writer, because we're going to talk a bit about your book today, along with
perhaps we will.
Perhaps we will.
Perhaps we will.
Thinking about it.
Let's just see.
Perhaps reclaiming the space between doubt and dogmatism. And so let's start off with some of that, and Kevin's going to get things going for us.
Sure.
All right. Perhaps we will. So this is going to be a long day. So I really love the title of this book when it was sent to me from InterVarsity Press. Shout out to Krista Clayton over there, who keeps reminding me of all you great authors and helping get you on here. It immediately caught my attention. I had said to you before we started recording that I'm a great fan of John Caputo's writing, and this is something he explores a lot. And of course, another guy we've got coming up on the podcast in a couple of weeks is Peter Enns, and part of this book actually speaks of Peter Enns, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. So I love the premise. You contend that speculation, or the ability to say perhaps, is sometimes required as we stand on the foundation of Scripture and on the shoulders of saints, as you write. And you say in the book that it's from that vantage point that we're able to peek and perch into the blank spaces. You refer to a faith-seeking imagination, which I absolutely love. I think imagination is greatly lost in our postmodern world. So I love that you use continental drift as a metaphor at the beginning of this book for the sort of fragmentation we see in societies and families And heaven help us, even in our churches or in our sort of camps, our tribes, like evangelicals, for instance, or conservatives, pick your theological camp. There's no doubt that different organizations, religions, and denominations are seeing this drifting apart. You make the point in your book that fragmentation is in our human tribes is to be expected, especially right now, because things are so polarized at the moment, right? And you point out that evangelicals have never really been a monolith, even though they're often written about that way and spoken about that way. And that basically the divide that we see among evangelicals right now is summarized by one of two extremes. You write about the land of unchecked doubt and the land of strict and strident dogmatism. You write, my claim is that neither of these alluring postures best characterizes a Christian attitude towards the vexing questions of faith. For that alone, sir, I give you an A+ to using one of my favorite words in the English lexicon, vexing. I love the word vexing. And my goal, you write, is to set forth a third space by which to reclaim the sacred ground between certainty and skepticism. And you call that ground perhaps. Tell us more about that basic premise, that thesis of your book, of setting up that middle ground, if you will. Middle ground is not the right word for it, because I think I think it's deeper than that. I think it simplifies it too much, but that space of perhaps.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of us in our culture feel a bit like we're kind of being terrorized by the fringes. And wherever you locate yourself theologically or politically or scientifically, it seems like the loudest voices are coming from the fringes. And so that metaphor of continental drift, I talk about at the beginning of these strange creatures called geologists, which I don't know a whole lot about geology, but they say that the Earth's continents were once united as this single massive landmass called Pangea, but over time things drifted. And to quote, the poet, the center cannot hold, things fall apart. And W.B. Yeats. And I feel like a lot of Christians feel that way, that the center cannot hold, that we're being increasingly ruled by the fringes. And on one side, increasingly sort of narrow or fundamentalist or angry voices of religious dogmatism, where the camp is never quite small enough. And then eventually it's just maybe me and my dog. The only ones left. And even the dog is a little suspect. You don't know what he's doing in his spare time.
Does the dog post on Facebook everything you ever wanted to hear and believe? Because it has to be the echo chamber, right? So
there's this sense of increasingly narrow or fundamentalist dogmatism on one side, maybe on the right. And on the other side, there's the land of the nuns, where people who formerly found a home within a particular religious tribe, but now increasingly don't feel like they belong and are sort of sliding off of the edge of the increasingly flat earth, so to speak, and no longer find themselves within a Christian context, or at least they're not sure that they can. And many of those are my former students. Some of them are pastors or former pastors who, especially over the last year and a half, have just said, I don't know if I can do this anymore.
Can't do it.
And it's not always driven by theological critiques as much as it is by social and political upheaval and animosity within their pews and even around their family dinner tables. And so it's a book that deals with theology in the place of speculation, but it's also a book that hopes to meet people kind of where they are in this sort of dangerous middle space between the warring extremes, so to speak.
It's as parish priests who we live in that, don't we, Kevin? And that kind of microcosm of that. I mean, I remember coming to my parish here in London a little over 3 years ago. I arrived and a lady asked me, let's get together for coffee. And I said, great. And we sat down and she looked right at me and said, now, what is your stance on same-sex blessings?
Tell me about the gays.
So before we even broke bread together in a sacramental sense, it was let's make sure that we, if we're going to divide, let's divide now.
Are you for them or against them, Rob? Come on.
But
now's
that's
the time.
That's just what happens, and it's evident in our own little tribes.
And it's tiresome. I mean, I remember getting a 5-page letter in my previous appointment when Rob and I first met when we lived in a town, across the river from Detroit in Windsor, which, by the way, I don't know if you follow the Detroit Lions, but they found a new way to lose on Sunday. But anyway, that's a whole nother matter. But I got a 5-pager handwritten about how I had built a wall between me and God, and it was a wall of sin, and it was all about the gays, and the whole thing. And I mean, thanks be to God, it was so rare, and that parish has been rare here that I've been able to stave it off. But for those who find themselves in that tricky place that you're talking about, Josh, where like it's a barrage. It's like that tennis ball machine. It just keeps coming. I can see how you're probably hearing about former students that are saying, I'm checking out. I've had enough of this. Yeah. Amazing. Listen, let's talk a little bit more about doubt and dogmatism then. So in discussing skepticism, you say there are trifecta of forces pertaining to science, politics, and sexuality that have had a lot to do with an understandable skepticism inside of evangelicalism. And so you talk about those, but you also write about dogmatism. You write, the dogmatism I describe has two features. One, a shrillness of tone. We've certainly heard that. And two, the presumption of certainty on positions that are far from obvious. On the matter of tone, it's not always, as John Wesley called it, the heart strangely warmed, but the face strangely flushed. Dogmatism carries an anger that types in all caps. Rob, have you had any of these? I get a couple of these a week.
One or two.
They type in all caps, replaces listening with loudness, and comes with an extra side of exclamation points. God, I love the way you write, Josh. In fairness to the dogmatist, prophetic indignation may seem warranted within the fallen culture, but that does not always make it helpful. In describing a shift towards strident rhetoric with American evangelicalism, Rick Warren details the danger. The Bible calls the church the body of Christ. Yet, what's happened in the last 100 years is that the hands and feet have been amputated, and the church has just been a mouth, and primarily it's been known for what it's against. Now, I thought that is bang on. So could you say more about these two extremes and why the space of perhaps is so critical right now for the church and what's going on?
Yeah, I think that one of the things we could say about the two extremes of kind of a crippling secular doubt verging into kind of maybe atheism or agnosticism, and then a strident religious dogmatism, is they're in what I would call a codependent relationship. They're mutually reinforcing, and they actually need each other in some ways to exist, or at least the people who have monetized those extremes need each other to exist. That's what drives their Twitter posts. They're in their fundraising letters. It really is a codependent relationship. It's not that they are exclusively at war. It's that they are using one another, and that they're locked in a kind of perverse embrace, in a sense, even as they are throwing some punches as well. And so that's one thing I would say, is that those two extremes feed off of each other, and the algorithms certainly drive that and exacerbate that as outrage sells ad revenue, and so that's maybe the first thing I would say about that. And I think I try to define what I mean by the extreme of doubt, because I'm very careful to say in the book that, look, doubt is not always a bad thing.
No, yeah.
It sometimes can be beneficial, because as we walk through seasons of doubt, God grows our faith. We move sometimes from naivety to maturity. It can be something like the wilderness often is in the scriptures, that is a place of trial and testing, but also something that we look back upon later and see the sort of pillar of cloud and fire that were leading us. And so it's not exclusively a bad thing. And it's not avoidable in many cases. I don't know how you avoid doubt, especially in the wake of trauma and after the year and a half that we've just had in the local church. And so I want to be careful, because of the book's subtitle, Reclaiming This Space Between Doubt and Dogmatism. I'm not saying that doubt is either avoidable or always bad. And yet, and then here's kind of the transitionary phrase, when we read scripture does speak against doubt quite a fair bit. And so we can't move from a kind of vilification of doubt to a sort of valorizing of it. And that's what I'm pushing back against a little bit in some of the writers that are out there, that it seems that, I think, in the helpful effort to balance the teeter-totter, so to speak,
Yeah.
wherein faith has been confused with certainty, sometimes there's a move that almost valorizes doubt in a way that Scripture just doesn't quite do. And so what I'm trying to do in some of the chapters is say, well, what does the Bible actually say about doubt? What is it really talking about when we see those words like doubt in our English translations? And so that's maybe a second thing I would say about that dichotomy is really you have to define what you mean by this sort of dangerous or crippling doubt, just as we want to define dogmatism as a matter of tone and emphasis as well.
I remember we had Brian McLaren on a little while back, and he had a new book out, which is called Faith After Doubt. And, kind of made that case about, and the proof is in the pudding. Often when you talk to people about their spiritual lives, oftentimes they've come to a deeper and newer understanding out of doubt, that it ended up to be a doorway in some respects for them as they look back on it. So you have a fascinating conversation about the difference between the binding of Isaac, which is a story in Genesis, and the story of Jephthah, which is in Judges. Could you tell our listeners a little bit about how these two biblical figures kind of help us cultivate a faith-seeking understanding?
Yeah. Jephthah is a in many ways an embarrassment for us that he appears not just in the book of Judges, where there are lots of embarrassing figures and
no shortage of embarrassing figures there.
But he also appears in the book of Hebrews, in the kind of so-called Faith Hall of Fame. That's got to be a typo. Maybe there's a different Jephthah who was like a stay-at-home dad or something. But I place Jephthah and Abraham alongside of each other because they both are involved in this kind of just horrifying practice of being willing to sacrifice a child. And based on Judges, I think Jephthah did it. And obviously the Akedah, or the binding of Isaac in Genesis 22, Abraham was at least willing to do it. And so we call Abraham, our forefather in the faith. And what do we say about Jephthah? I think Jephthah is sort of Abraham with wires crossed, and
that's good.
A lack of sort of theological understanding for who God is, and but those are stories that a lot of people, especially people who are on the verge of losing their faith, you're like, what do you do with that? What do you do with, especially Genesis 22? Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens has this great quote. I think it's in his book, God is Not Great, where he says that all three monotheisms are willing to praise Abraham for hearing voices and then being willing to sacrifice his son. And he basically is implying, look, if somebody said that, we'd say, you have a mental health issue, and we don't see you as a hero. We see you as at least someone to be pitied and perhaps a villain, and yet Abraham, I think, exercises what I would call a risky theological imagination that allows him to obey the voice of God, even when it doesn't seem to make sense. And so he does engage in what I would call a kind of speculative perhapsing as he's headed toward Moriah. And I'm not using that as some sort of get out of jail free card for every time you want to do something absurd or certainly abusive or violent or anything like that.
Damn it. I was looking forward to some absurdity this afternoon.
But in Hebrews, it says that in the English translations differ, that Abraham reasoned, or he reckoned, or he considered that God could bring back Isaac from the dead, that he could raise him up. And that's why he was willing to obey this voice, by the way, that he had come to know over many years, and he had come to know as faithful, because it's the voice that had brought forth life from death already. Sarah's dead womb and Abraham's dead body had given birth to this son. And so he has this, we use all this language from COVID. He has this data point.
Yes. Yes.
It is this kid. I imagine it's like this kid that won't shut up. He's my constant data point that this voice is faithful.
Right.
And yet this voice is asking me to do something that doesn't make any sense. And he obeys because he considered that God could even raise the dead. And I think in that way, Abraham is our forefather in the faith, because every one of us at some point has to reckon or reason or say, maybe this is a God that can even raise the dead. And our faith as Christians rests in that singular reality of resurrection. And so in that sense, Abraham is our forefather in that sort of speculative perhapsing, which, by the way, he's both right and wrong. And I think that's an important point about saying perhaps, is that we'll get it wrong sometimes. And Abraham is wrong in the sense that God does not need to raise up Isaac from the ash heap.
Right.
There's a different way that it plays out. And yet, even in his wrongness, his sort of speculative reasoning gets at something true, that one day there will be this beloved son who will be raised up after offering this horrific and in some ways inexplicable sacrifice. And so both his rightness and his wrongness and his boldness and his uncertainty, I think, are kind of gesturing toward what Christians need at one point or another in their walk with God.
Well, what I like there is you're elevating the reckoning is a great word that you use, but that sort of speculativeness, that questioning, that at least examination of, maybe this is what God can do. And I think that in our communities, and I mean, Rob can testify to this as well, I'm sure, but sometimes our communities are frozen, afraid to sort of explore that place of the unknown. It's what leads to this. Well, we've never done it that way before, right? Or things are always, we say in the Anglican Church, if a chair sits in a place for more than a week, it's tradition. You never move it, right? But it's a lack of imagination, again, in at times an inability to sort of engage in a risky business of trusting a God, knowing that we might get it wrong, and maybe in the act of making that gesture or being together and making those mistakes together, there's a revelation in that. I mean, wouldn't you say? Like, is that a...
Yeah, I think so. I think that even in our misfires, sometimes God brings fruit from that's good. And that's one of the things I explore, and I give kind of in the second chapter, I call it a very speculative history, where I look at three figures from church tradition who have said perhaps in different ways.
I'm going to stop you there, because Ian is going to hit that nail right on the head right now.
Very smoothly. And
that's very nicely done, Josh. It's like Josh knew what was coming next. That's damn good.
So you write about these three historical exemplars. You write about, I believe his name's Origen of Alexandria,
Origen,
Julian of Norwich, and Jonathan Edwards. So how do these provide insight as examples for us in seeking after imaginative theologies? I'm assuming you're about to go into that.
So
when I interrupted you so that you can get it.
So just go on.
Well, they're three figures who've each been influential in different ways. They're from different periods of church history. So Origen from sort of the patristic era, Julian of Norwich from the Middle Ages, and Jonathan Edwards from the modern period. They're from different traditions. And so there's diversity there in different ways, and each one of them is daring. Each one of them strikes us as a little bit strange, in different ways. And so in each case, I think you can see both some of the dangers of speculative theology or perhapsing, and also some of the potential benefits. Some of our doctrine of the Trinity, comes forth by way of Origen, and in ways, but that he had not necessarily applied some of those principles. And And so each one of them, I think, offers maybe some cautions. I talk about sort of the guardrails of perhapsing, some things we need to keep in mind so that we don't sort of go off the rails into just what-ifery. And each one gives some benefits, or shows some of the benefits of being able to exercise a theological imagination.
Big fan of Julian in Norwich. She's become very popular in Anglican circles in the last 30 years or so, I think, and all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of beings shall be well. But I think that she in particular, when I was reading your book and reading about, I was really pleased to see that you had teased that apart too, because I think, again, and because her particular manifestation of faith was so mystical and it was dreams and visions and all that stuff, that when you read the divine revelations of love, it's it's psychedelic, man. I mean, it's like but it's you read that and you sort of come away thinking, at how many planes did she reach, to sort of engage all of that. And here we are these many centuries later, quoting these words of hers that were so profound, right? I mean, but it was a willingness to engage in a way that is different.
I think one of the things that's interesting with Julian is, she writes these two texts. The first text is quite short. It's basically, here's my vision. And then maybe around 30 years later, it takes her a while to work on it, she writes this longer text in which she is reflecting on what the vision meant. And so you might say, well, why include Julian in a book about imaginative perhapsing or speculation? Because a vision, if it's anything, it's received. It's not sort of something you set forth as, here's an idea, like the Apostle Paul doesn't, that's not how his Damascus Road encounter went,
Right.
But what I think you see in Julian is, in that longer text over years, she is trying to decipher what this vision meant. There are things she doesn't understand about the vision. And so she is saying perhaps in different ways, and trying to figure out what Christ wanted to teach her in this vision that unsettled her, and at the same time gave her a sense of God's universal love for not just every creature, but every entity in the cosmos, right down to the smallest hazelnut,
Yes, yeah.
So she's a fascinating figure in many ways.
Yeah. Let's go back to those guardrails that you mentioned for a moment. You do caution that they're necessary, and you're quite right. You write, there's no foolproof external way to tell whether one is carrying the fire of abiding goodness or simply walking to one's tragic demise. No guardrail can make the road of life completely safe, nor can any set of rules fully establish how we do the work of sacred imagination. Yet that doesn't diminish the importance of establishing some basic helps for the same purpose along the way. Tell us about those basic helps. Tell us about some of those.
Yeah. I thought 10 was a fitting number of commandments for no reason in particular. But
that's why I said some. I didn't know if you wanted to remember them all or not.
I probably can't remember them all.
Yeah, I was going to say, can you list them like you list the 10 commandments?
A little bit of inside baseball for people who publish books is that the amount of time between when you finish writing the book and when it comes out sometimes allows you to forget everything that's in the book.
I was going to say, you're probably at least a year, right?
At least a year. And so sometimes, I'm sure I said something on that.
Yeah, but I don't remember what I said. Whatever.
I base that metaphor a little bit on the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, but also on Cormac McCarthy's The Road. And so one of the things I try to do in the book is to interweave fiction with theology. And there's this line in The Road, Cormac McCarthy's, Pulitzer-winning novel that also obviously became a movie, where the young boy and the father say, we're carrying the fire, we're carrying the fire. And this is this note of like, we're doing something that matters, and there's, virtue and hope in it. And yet they're not quite sure how it's going to turn out. Is it a tragedy or is it not? And so I think there's a bit of that in the Christian life, that you're not quite sure. Some how some of your decisions or your ideas are going to sort of echo out into the future and sort of have this butterfly effect, and so some of the guardrails are the ones I can remember anyway.
Yeah, this is a test, Josh.
Yeah,
I have them open in front of me. Okay, so we're watching.
One of them I mentioned is the need to be clear about what you are unclear about. To be clear about the unclear, to be honest about the things that you don't know.
Right. Know what you don't know. Yeah.
And that's a virtue. We don't need to fake certainty or be like the preacher who wrote, in the margin of his or her sermon manuscript, logic is weak, shout louder. And so
try that one.
That's very good.
And sometimes I think that added volume shows that we know we're losing an argument. And so we need to be clear about what we're unclear about. The second one, or at least a different one that I mentioned, is the need to mean your maybes, to actually mean it when you say maybe. So we can't use perhaps as a kind of dodge, right, to just throw out these wild hair ideas without any evidence, without any support, and just say, I'm just asking questions here. I'm just throwing out, well, like, okay, but not all questions are good. And so we need to be honest on both sides, both about what we don't know and about when we are saying maybe. We can't use it as a hedge to avoid critique or to just sort of ride our particular hobby horse. We need to not go alone. And what I mean by that is we need fellow travelers on the way of sacred imagination. It can't just be this individualistic pursuit. We need community, and we need fellow travelers, not just in our local context, in the local church, but we need fellow travelers across the centuries.
Right.
And in many cases, I think there's a word there for Christians who feel homeless right now. First of all, one of the problems is we ever thought we could find a home within a particular partisan political tribe, or that's a first problem. But secondly, I think where the living are failing us, the dead can often be our guides. And we need to read across centuries and not just across the Twitter feed or the news headlines on various news outlets. And so those are some things that I mention as guardrails to be clear about the unclear, to mean it when you say maybe. Don't go alone. Lean into the tradition and not just the day's headlines. There are a bunch of other ones. You can probably remind me what they are, but those are a few of them.
No, I mean, I just think, are you trying to tell me that everything needed for salvation is not found on Twitter? But what you're talking about there in terms of that going across the centuries is particularly attractive to me in terms of the community of saints. Like I think that like when we talk about Julian and Norwich, or when we raise the lives of the saints, some modern saints, when we lift up Martin Luther King, or when we talk about Dorothy Day, or when we raise up these folks who've lived and lived their own perhapsness, if you will, I think that there's something really quite profound in all of that, because I think that we are disappointed by what we see around us a lot, and sometimes reaching back across, Rob, like it's
yeah, very much so. And it's there's a theme here I'm hearing as we're discussing all this, and it's around this idea of certainty. And not necessarily like, Lord knows, I would love to have certainty, especially to all the people that come up to me when I got a collar on and need an answer, right? And figure that I have the answer, or that there is an answer. But you write about certainty in the book too. And so I just wanted to ask you a bit about that. Yeah. In the view of Krish Kandiah, the Bible has more room for doubt, uncertainty, and struggle than we have ever allowed ourselves to believe. I think that's so true and important. And in keeping with this logic, scholars like Gregory Boyd and Peter Enns suggest that the pursuit of certainty has actually become an idol and a sin within contemporary Christianity. The opposite of faith, and we've touched on this, the opposite of faith is not doubt, says a common adage, but the opposite of faith is certainty. So in this chapter, you go on to talk about tribalism being the new nihilism, and you write about the heel digging effect. I'm wondering if you could share a bit more about that.
Yeah, I think we lean into claims to certainty even when we're often not certain. When we feel attacked, when we
bullshit abides,
yes.
or it abounds. Bullshit abounds.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think that's what I mean by the heel digging effect, is that when our ideas are lampooned or critiqued, the tendency is not to question them. It's often to dig in our heels and to double down on stupid sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think there's a word there for progressives as well. I'm pretty harsh against kind of my own theological zip code in some ways in this book. But there's a critique there for progressive Christians as well, that there is a reverse result, I think, than the one many progressive Christians want when they lampoon or they caricature or they polemicize fundamentalists. And what it tends to result in is not so much the fundamentalists saying, well, okay, I'll come over here and be good progressive. Just
yeah.
If anything, it drives, again, these are mutually repulsing continents. There's this fissure through the earth that is driving them apart. And so the heel digging effect is just my way of giving a name to that tendency for us to dig in our heels in the face of a perceived slight or threat or mockery, or that it has a result that was it was not the one that was intended in some cases. And that's what I mean by that particular effect in the church.
I mean, how you see it play out right now. I mean, right now we're in the middle of, I don't know how it is in Oklahoma, but there is a bit of a situation going on with COVID in most of the world. And we've got a couple of provinces here in Canada that are just out of control because of politics, really. But you hear exactly what you're talking about. I mean, if you listen to folks being interviewed, and some of it is just mind-boggling. I mean, it's like, as you say, it's not as though they talk with certainty, but they can't possibly be certain because they don't know what they're talking about. But the heels are it, right? And it's like, this is immovable. It's an immovable force. And it's having an adverse effect on our families. I mean, I just heard a story last week of a father who will miss his daughter's wedding because the province here now requires a vaccine passport. And his last day to get vaccinated prior to her wedding coming up would have been last Friday. And they all pleaded with him. He no longer talks to his 6 siblings. He's a man in his 70s who will miss his daughter's wedding, and they're as close as this. But he told her, no, he's not taking a vaccine. He will not go to her wedding. And so that's a lifelong fissure now over this thing. Like, that's how hard the heels are dug in. Like, are you seeing a lot of this yourself too, Josh, over this particular issue?
Oh, absolutely. And, I'm in a different context than you guys are. I mean, you talk about being in England or in Canada. I'm in Oklahoma. Oklahoma is not just in the color of our dirt, but in the color of our politics. It is the reddest state in the country by many accounts. And so depending where you are, that the sort of voices that are in the majority, or if you want to say it this way, the particular extreme that gets the most attention is going to be different. When I talk to people who are in different countries or different parts of the United States, I interviewed a guy named AJ Swoboda recently about his book on doubt. He lives in Portland area or in Oregon. It's a different zip code than mine, right? And what is effective in my zip code in building bridges and trying to kind of love my neighbor and move the ball forward, it's not going to be the same approach maybe that's effective in a different zip code. And there is a kind of need for contextualization in the way pastors and church leaders try to rebuild some of these bridges, depending on where their particular church is on the map, so to speak.
Just to go back to, you had mentioned earlier about doubt and scripture and saying, it's not always useful, right? As you point out. So you make, to make this point, you reference that that in Scripture we're given at least three, more, I'm sure, but you referenced three of them, about how doubt is unavoidable and can even be positive. There's doubt and the mountain moving prayer in Mark. Doubt and the divided soul is found in James in the first chapter. And then after Christ's resurrection, as related to in Matthew 28, doubt about his resurrection. Can you take perhaps one of those and help us differentiate between helpful and unhelpful forms of questioning?
Yeah, I think in most of them, we really are not always helped by the English word doubt, because we come to these words with preconceived definitions. And in many cases, for English speaking persons, the preconceived definition is, well, doubt is when you experience uncertainty about a particular fact claim, right? And so the experience of uncertainty or questioning, that's doubt. And so we see all these passages where the one who doubts is, like waves tossed, being tossed by the waves of the sea and unstable in all his or her ways, and don't doubt but believe, Jesus says. And so the first thing I would say, maybe a general statement rather than drilling down into any one of those passages really deep, is that we need to delve into, okay, well, when the biblical authors use a particular, say, Greek word in this case, what do they mean by that? And so in many cases, what I argue, leaning upon some New Testament scholars and others, is that they're not talking about the experience of uncertainty. They're talking in many cases over divided allegiances, or the dipsikos is sort of the two-souled person. The person who is being sort of riven into by one side of them wants to go this way, one side wants to go this way. And I think different instances of doubt words in the scriptures, they're not all talking about the same thing, but in most cases, what's being critiqued is not honest questioning. It's a division or a contradiction in our loyalties or our allegiances. And I lean a little bit on the New Testament scholar Matthew Bates, and his work on pistis, the Greek word for faith or trust or faithfulness, and because doubt is often juxtaposed with pistis, faith, trust. And he argues that in many cases, a better reading of pistis would be something like allegiance, or trusting allegiance, rather than just mental certitude, or even rather than even just like belief, and so I think we need to, in all those cases, look carefully at the passage, but also look carefully at what is being meant by that word that is translated doubt, rather than just assuming we know what it means, and it's critiquing the presence of questions or the absence of certainty. I think in most cases that's not quite what it means.
Or we could dig our heels in and say, "Now, Josh, I know what doubt means. You don't get to tell me what doubt means."
I am certain
of
my doubts.
I'm not having any more of that from you. The next thing you know, I'll be getting better 5G because of the way I believe in doubt.
There are great cultural references in this book. You reference like Harry Potter, the Chronicles of Narnia, Friends, and a bunch of other stuff. Talk to us about the importance of story and imagination and how these many cultural influences have shaped your own faith.
Well, I love to read, and I love to read widely. I think that's something that's needed in the church. I think in most cases, I'm a preacher. I preach a fair bit in the local church context, and I think good preachers are often good readers, and good readers really read widely. And we need a little bit. We need kind of a broadening of our bookshelves within the church. And so part of the reason for some of the cultural references or the literary references, I just like it. It was just more fun to write a book that included not just Kierkegaard and Karl Barth, but Dumbledore and Flannery O'Connor. And, so part of it is just I just thought it was more fun to write that way. But And the other reason is really that I think form needs to match content. And if you're writing about the need for a reinvigorated Christian imagination, it would be really bad to do that in a very didactic, turgid, analytical way. You need story. And the imagination, I think, story is sort of like the gasoline that runs the engine of the imagination. Yeah. Sure. And so I weave in a lot of fiction from some of my favorite fictional authors, whether it's Cormac McCarthy or Marilyn Robinson or John Steinbeck. And I hope that works in, kind of like leaven mixed in with the bread of the argument to make it taste better for one thing, but also to help it be digested.
Right. Well, hey, and you're following good company, because there was this guy a little over 2,000 years ago that kind of liked telling stories and trying to get people to imagine and see. Perhaps it'll come to me. It'll come to me. Well, look, hey, we're talking about story. Let's finish up the podcast with story. I wonder if we could do that, Josh. Hoping you could share a story with us. One of the beautiful parts of the book is that throughout you have written these beautiful vignettes, and I think there's a story called is it Equator, right? It's fantastic. I wonder if you would read that for us to kind of finish off our time together.
Sure. And just a little kind of context to maybe set the stage is that the metaphor is continental drift. And so each of these vignettes begins with sort of some GPS coordinates. And in between the nonfiction chapters, I write this narrative about a young lady named Eliza, who is in the midst of kind of losing her faith. And because of all the forces we've described, and in some ways, the hero of the story is a like 900-pound tortoise named Wilbur, and so my son Teddy, who's 4, likes turtles, and so that part is for him. But this is one of the vignettes, the one that you alluded to. It starts with this junior year of college, that is. The old tortoise came to the home of Frank and Ethel Mercer in the same way Sophie and Eliza had, through a series of unlikely events. Ethel initially encountered the creature during a year-long Fulbright scholarship at the Estación Científica, a research outpost in the Galapagos Islands far off the coast of Ecuador. She was there in 1959 to study the local fauna, but her true goal was to figure out her future. Should she marry the handsome Black preacher she had marched beside in Alabama? Could she marry the disparate poles of her affections, science, faith, a longing for justice? She needed time to think it over. The rest is history. A smaller version of Wilbur first limped up the front step of Ethel's bungalow one Sunday morning on a wounded leg. She found him crushing and eating a carton of eggs that had just been delivered for Ethel's breakfast. Frank now jokes that the event foreshadowed how all of their, quote, adoptables were ushered into the Mercer home. Decades later, Ethel maintained contact with an old friend at the Estación Científica. And after hearing from Sophie how Eliza was struggling with school and family and life, the old woman pulled some strings. A fully funded internship was arranged, a semester in the Galapagos for college credit. Eliza accepted. 2 years prior, desertion had been the plan, and the Galapagos sounded even more remote than England's Lake District. She had her opportunity. The goal, at least officially, would be for Eliza to explore the intersections of the island's biodiversity in her chosen field of poetry. An unlikely marriage, Ethel called it. But that, she reminded Eliza, had always been her style. Then, not long before the flight, another curveball. Eliza had stopped by Frank and Ethel's to do a load of laundry, and while there, the old woman mentioned that another lady once connected to the college had been accepted for a scientific internship in the Galapagos. Oh, you know Claire, Ethel said with delight as she told Eliza about the biology major who would be joining her. Eliza tried to wipe the appearance of having tasted sour milk from her face. She hadn't seen Claire since freshman year when the preacher's daughter responded tersely to Eliza's roommate breakup email. No problem, Claire had said. I'm not coming back. Claire was what they called a legacy student at the Christian college, going back to biblical times through her father and her father's father, all the way to Moses and the prophets. So Eliza had been surprised at her abrupt exit. Now, 2 years later, Eliza was incensed that her long-awaited flight would include a stowaway, or perhaps a chaperone. The line from Virgil by way of Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited came suddenly to mind. Et in Arcadia ego. It was uttered of death, but it had other applications. The past is an invasive species. It always clears customs. The two girls finally glimpsed each other across the airport terminal before boarding the Boeing 757 that would soon point its nose toward the equator. Eliza tried to be polite. Claire looked different somehow, smaller almost. Eliza, I'm so glad you're here. I've been trying not to chicken out all morning. Me too, Eliza said. I haven't flown much. I'll sit by you, Claire remarked. It's open seating in coach. She appeared to be knitting nervously with several spools of yarn in a plastic Walmart sack. You can help me work on my security blanket. I brought mine too. And Eliza gestured to her grandmother's quilt that had formerly draped her dorm room bed. And then the aircraft started boarding. It was hard to quantify what happened on that lengthy flight, crossing hemispheres and continents. It was as if an invisible barrier broke between the two young women. Perhaps for Eliza, it had something to do with the two Bloody Marys consumed to calm anxiety. Or perhaps it was a phenomenon she had felt previously with her brother Jeremy. It was striking how a person who had once been at best a cause of annoyance could become a source of comfort merely by being the one familiar face around. Familiarity bred contempt until one lacked anything familiar. The cloud billows out the window looked like mountains rising from the deep, and the sun sank in the horizon. Eliza finally worked up the courage to ask, "So why'd you leave?" Claire paused for several seconds. "I got pregnant," she said, without looking up. Eliza's mouth fell open and she dropped her crochet needle. "I didn't tell anyone," Claire went on. A cascade of confession followed. The clandestine drive to an abortion clinic on the other side of town, then turning around in the parking lot, the miscarriage, the sense, ubiquitous among 16-year-olds, that she had never belonged to the community in which she looked completely at home. Claire continued, "I met Ethel through the Crisis Pregnancy Center. They have a program that gives free counseling and ultrasounds. I started coming to the knitting group and Bible study Ethel leads for women at the center." "Sounds riveting," Eliza responded, in an awkward attempt at a joke. "It was what I needed," Claire said. "After the miscarriage, Ethel and Jesus were the things that got me through." "I always wondered why you left," Eliza responded seriously. "I just needed to get away." "I get it," Eliza replied. But before she could elaborate, a voice came over the plane's loudspeaker to inform them that they had crossed the invisible line of the equator.
That's great. That's awesome. Yeah. We usually do. We have poets on sometimes, and we give them the.
I can't
give you one of
snap,
those.
so
Yeah,
I do
can't
this.
snap.
I do this. It's for
wonderful.
I'm mime snapping.
No, that is. I must say that is perhaps the best story I've heard all day.
Yeah.
It really is. That was good.
Yeah.
That was good. Hey, Josh, we can't thank you enough for spending the time with us today, for your work and for your witness, and for the book, perhaps Reclaiming the Space Between Doubt and Dogmatism. We encourage folks to find that wherever they get their books and enjoy that. And that's I always find that this kind of reading really helpful to me too as a preacher, because it expands my vision of things, which is, I think, so important when we do this kind of work to bring to those that show up on Sundays or wherever we are. So thank you for all that.
And to remind folks that if you don't know where to go get it, if you visit our webpage, thevicarscrossing.com, and click on books, you can click a direct link to order that book and download it as a Kindle or an audio, or you can get a softback or whatever you want to do, or you can go to your local booksellers. We always encourage people to do and say, bring this book in for us and support the little guys too. But if you're not into all that and you want a quick link, just go to thevicarscrossing.com.
Cool. Okay.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for giving me some vicars in my life. I appreciate it.
Oh, no. Yay, man. Thanks for being here. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!